Thanks for coming on, Josh. I have to say I lobbied for this one. I kind of maybe twisted your arm a little bit. But the first thing we usually ask people is why you were interested in coming on. Why did you agree to this?
You mentioned that you were also looking for more, I guess, negative or less positive type of stories, and then that's kind of when a little light bulb went on. I was like, I think I might have a story that fits more in that category.
Yeah. That's what I remembered. And that because you were like, oh, like you're looking for shitty grandparents.
Yeah.
You're like, I have one of those.
Yep.
I was like, yes, we got one. So, well, let's get into it.
We actually call her grandmother Ying, which is the Chinese word for grandmother on the father's side of the family.
I called him Grandpa Foot.
We, in our native language, in Hindi, we call them Dada and Dadi.
My other grandmother would be Maman Bozorg, which is Persian for grandmother.
Muchechu means old woman in Kinyarwanda.
I called her Safta, which is a Hebrew word for grandma.
Everybody called her Mamitita.
We called her Mima Dede.
Grandma.
Hi, I'm Steph.
And I'm Robin. Welcome to Stories from Grandparents,
The podcast where we share stories about and from grandparents.
On today's episode, we have Steph's friend, Josh. And as you heard from the intro, it's a grandparent who's not of the warm and fuzzy variety. What did you think of this episode, Steph?
I thought, okay, first of all, I have to tell you, we're going to cut this out. We're not going to use this, but he's not really my friend. He's just an acquaintance.
As soon as I said it, I was like, she's probably going to tell me I'm not friends.
Yeah, like, actually, no, we're not friends. I'm like friend acquaintances with his wife, but he's a he's a lovely individual, but we're not going to be able to use friend in the, because he's going to be like,
okay.
Let
me text you. I don't really consider you a friend. Okay, let me start over, and I'll just say Josh.
Yeah.
On this episode, we have Josh, and as you heard from the intro, his grandmother was not of the typical warm and fuzzy variety. What did you think of this episode, Steph?
Well, as you said, it's not the typical grandparent story that we normally hear, and that ended up being really refreshing. And I think what comes through is that Josh is a very insightful, well-spoken person, and the way he approached sort of his memories of his grandmother and telling the story, I thought was really interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I totally agree.
I think another interesting part of this for me was learning more about the Mennonite religion, which I had often associated with like the horse and buggy kind of culture. And so I thought that was a very interesting part of hearing his story. Was the context.
Yeah.
And we haven't really had any Manitoba representation.
That's
yet,
true.
I don't think.
That's true. So here it is.
So, well, let's get into it. Who are we talking about today?
We were talking about my mother's mother, who I always called Granny.
And what can you tell us about her? Like, who was she? Where is she from? When was she born? What was her life like?
When was she born? I don't know. I don't know.
She was old.
She's actually still alive. She's
still alive.
She's still alive. She is the only grandparent I have left, and if I had to guess, I'm going to say she's probably just over 80 right now.
Okay.
I haven't spoken to her for a number of years. She was, well, like myself, we were all from a small religious region of rural southeastern Manitoba in the Red River Valley, Mennonite country, where we all grew up the same way and went to all the same churches. And my grandmother, I guess what was her life? She was a farm wife. She married a farmer in small Manitoba town, and she had 3 children, and that was her life.
Can you give us some context about the Mennonite community and the religion and like what's unique about that?
Yeah, sure. So it all depends on how much context people already have.
I have like pretty much none. So I think Amish, when I think Mennonite, I think that's what I picture.
A lot of people will defer to Amish. A very similar, like the Pennsylvania Dutch or like a Hutterite, a colony type living situation. Those are all generally kind of connected to the same general period of time. But the current Mennonite culture is more, they have more adopted the quote unquote regular Canadian life. Like if you go into any of these small towns, Winkler or Steinbach or Altona or any of these towns, they're all going to look like regular small Canadian towns to you. You won't relatively see a difference. You might notice there's a few more churches than the average little town. But generally speaking, it's going to look the same. But the culture of it, it's very conservative. It's very closed. So while it looks like an open community, and certainly you could show up and people aren't going to drive you out of town, you're not going to find it very welcoming if you overstay your welcome. A very common touchstone for a lot of people is a book by a Mennonite Canadian writer from, I think she is from Steinbach, Miriam Taves. She wrote a book called The Complicated Kindness. It became very popular because Oprah featured it in her book club. So a lot of people have read that book. So when I tell people that that's where I come from, a lot of people will make comparisons to that book.
So there's an adoption of regular Canadian culture. So you're living with electricity, technology, TV, all that stuff. Like that's all a part of your life.
Yeah, exactly. There's a real estate office. There's a law office. There's a grocery store. We all have radios in our cars. There's all of those regular things.
Can you talk a bit about, I can't remember, you told me how many churches were in your town, how those end up splinting from, because I feel like that's like a big Mennonite thing, right? Like
it
churches
is
splintering off.
It is. So, I mean, it depends on how much you know about your history of religions and that kind of stuff. But, there's the Martin Luther Lutheran separation from the Catholic Church. And then there's the entire Anabaptist movement that goes back to, I think, 1500s. Does that sound right? I think. Anyway.
I think so.
And then because of, that's kind of part of it's kind of ingrained, this splintering from, as soon as there's something you oppose the views on, then it splinters. One of the ones that my dad always laughed about is the funniest one was because a big part of the culture is to not be showy, to not show off, and to be very humble. And when I think it was buttons were being put onto jackets instead of snaps, that you would just snap your your jacket closed and a button would come through, and some people thought that was too prideful. That was too prideful to have buttons that people could see as a decoration on your jacket. And that splintered one of the churches. Like I forget which two, but it's caused a major rift. And they literally split into two. And in my lifetime growing up,
button church.
Oh yeah, exactly. There was the non-button church and the button church.
But just not a big culture of resolving differences.
Nope.
I just can't get over this button thing. Like look at her showing off with her blouse that had buttons coming through, and it's just like they're just functional.
No. That's too much pride.
Yeah. So there's a lot of like modesty. That's another thing what I'm trying to picture, like day-to-day life for you and for your grandmother, a culture of modesty.
Absolutely. I actually make a joke to my father a lot where I will say, it's weird coming from a people who pride themselves on their humility. I mean, that sentence alone is a juxtaposition, right? And
it sounds like an oxymoron.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I guess like I'm trying to wrap my head around like what's the difference between that and just like going to a United Church or Presbyterian Church or I don't know, name another Protestant religion. I don't know.
Well, I guess it's hard to say. Other than in most towns of 5,000 or 7,000 people, you're going to have a Presbyterian church, a Baptist church, a Catholic, all of these different. There's going to be some of those, right? Mm-hmm. Whereas in the town I grew up in and all of the other towns in that region, it's all different versions of the same. So there's this sameness that is generally assumed. And then
part of your identity.
Right. And then anyone who doesn't have that flag attached to them is automatically viewed as an outsider and they would be, I guess they would be not trusted.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
Right. And I think you had mentioned that the United Church mostly welcomes people who've left the Mennonite churches.
Yeah. So the history of that particular United Church, which anybody who knows the region will probably have figured out which town I'm talking about now. That particular United Church, the Mennonites are a pacifist people. So when they immigrated to Canada, most came from Russia. And they came around, most Canadian Mennonites, at least in the southeastern Manitoba area where I'm from. Most of those will have come in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And when they came, they were granted, I don't know what the legal term is or the immigration term, but they were granted some type of religious exemption from ever having to participate in an active war. So they were granted this pacifist status. So when the World Wars came, any person who was Mennonite heritage had the ability to tell the government, no, thank you, I don't want to participate. And they were left alone. For World War II, I think it got a little bit more extreme. My grandfather, for example, who was young enough to have gone to war, he claimed his conscientious objector status, and he still had to put in something for the war effort. So he was sent to a logging camp in northern Ontario, taken away from his job. Like everybody else his age was taken and sent off to war, and he was sent to go drive a logging truck or something. But there was a group of first and second generation born in Canada Mennonites from my hometown who were Canadian kids, and they've believed in what the Allies were doing in World War II, and they decided to go. And they had the option for conscientious objector status, but they chose not to. They decided to go. And when they came home, they wanted to go back with their normal lives. And when they went to church on Sunday, they were told they weren't welcome. And that group of individuals started the United Church in that town. That's the reason that there is one non-Mennonite church in that town.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah. And of course, going back, if you have read A Complicated Kindness, a major part of that book is when the church decides this individual is no good, the church will decide that person is out and will tell their family, you have to decide to excommunicate, it's what they call it. You have to stop having any contact with that family member or friend or relative or whatever. You have to cut them off completely, never communicate with them again, cut them out of your life, or you will not be welcome back in this church. Now, in the book, that's done through a meeting at your home. I think in the book, there was a scene where all of these black sedans showed up, and it was the fathers of the church who come and deliver this news. I never saw it happen officially like that. I don't think it happens officially like that. I mean, maybe in some places it does, but I certainly didn't see it. But when you get excommunicated, it's exactly that. People stop talking to you. People give you the cold shoulder. It's pretty apparent that it's happening when it happens. And of course, that happened to my parents. And
okay. So I guess that's kind of that's what's and when you're talking about the closed society, because that was another thing I was kind of like not understanding, but it's like, yes, you're either in or you're out, and people will have to choose between their families or their children, etc., and the church, who their family's probably been connected to for like hundreds of years, and that's could be a really painful choice and very splitting.
Yeah, and it's not as blatant and obvious as happens in some other parts of society or cultures. They don't come in and spray paint slurs on your house or burn things on your lawn. Like it's never extreme like that. They just don't talk to you anymore, and they give you the cold shoulder, and they don't give you the common courtesies people have been giving you in the past. And and you don't even realize how much those things impact you until they all of a sudden stop, because then you definitely feel it and you know it, and it's very isolating and you feel very alone.
And just the idea that there's this whole community judging you.
Yeah.
And kind of keeping an eye out.
So one of the major defining areas or situations that happened in my youth was my mother worked for a company, and she got promoted in that company. And the place I come from is very patriarchal and very chauvinistic. And of course, the fact that a woman would succeed in the type of job she had, which was typically a traditional man's job, the rumor was that she was sleeping with her boss. To the point where my father, who owned a business in the community, received a letter, unposted. It was just put under his door on Royal Bank letterhead in a Royal Bank envelope. And that's only interesting because there was no Royal Bank in the town.
Oh.
The town does not have a Royal Bank. It had a TD Bank and a credit union, but there was no Royal Bank. So he had no idea who this would come from. And the letter simply said, talk around town is that your wife is fucking insert name. We feel she should resign her position immediately.
Oh, wow. Like resign her job position?
Yep.
Or like church? Oh,
nope.
Okay.
Job. Yep.
Okay.
Somebody in the community felt that my mother was fucking her boss and therefore did not have the morality to work for a private company in that town, and therefore should resign her position.
Wow.
And I think that goes a lot to tell you about, the type of conservatism that I grew up with, and that moment. I mean, that wasn't just a moment. That went on for years. That was, of course, very painful for my parents to deal with. That, of course, led to it being difficult for us as children, me and my sister. It was very difficult for all of us. And I basically moved away. I moved to Winnipeg as soon as I could, and I haven't looked back. My sister very much did the similar. And my parents finally left the town, and they were very happy that they had left that town and put it behind them.
There must have been such a shift in your family, though. Like, I wonder, if your parents had ever been on the other end of that type of judgment, and then received it. Like that must have been a shift, or like some sort of like realization there. Or were you guys always kind of more progressive and being like, That
is an interesting question. I have honestly not really thought or considered that. I have to imagine mob mentality or groupthink being what it is. I mean, how active they may or may not have been, I couldn't say, but they certainly would have been passive participants at the very minimum.
Yeah. Right? Because it had to have happened to other people. Like, they had to have been excommunicators at some point, like you'd think. Or at least, like, maybe not your parents, but, like the generations before, which kind of brings us to your grandma and how she factors into all of this, which is who we're here to gossip about.
That is correct. So, and I guess in a way, it's like since since Steph and I first started talking about this, I have really done a lot of not soul searching, but thinking about it, processing, because quite honest, it is something I actively try not to think about. So it's not something I really try to dwell on or focus on. But I gotta say, I would say that my mother's mother, my grandmother, and I guess that entire side of the family kind of wears a lot of that. They symbolize a lot of what that was. So they had nothing to do with anything involving what I went through in high school or my negative experiences, but I kind of attach it all to them.
Yeah.
And that is something I have realized about myself. But getting back to my grandmother, she very clearly didn't ever want to be a mother. I don't think she wanted to be a farm wife. I don't think she wanted to take care of a husband who was working in the fields. I don't think she wanted to do all of those things that are expected of a farm wife. I don't think she wanted to be a mother and do all the things that are expected of being a mother. I know that she has her entire life struggled with mental health issues. I know that she is diagnosed as bipolar. I know that a diagnosis of some kind came in the 1970s. So I can't imagine what it was like for her I'm sure that came with a lot of shame and embarrassment. Because the stigma already is bad for people with mental health issues. I can't imagine what it was like in a conservative, religious, chauvinistic society that already looks down on women and devalues women to then have a mental health diagnosis onto you as well. So yeah. I'm sure that played a large part into what was for her a difficult life, I imagine.
Is part of the religion not seeking like medical help, or
no?
That's not a part of it?
No,
okay.
no, that's not a part of it. There's no issue with that specifically. But again, small town conservative views aren't really open to talking about mental health issues or therapy or any of those things.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Because I didn't read A Complicated Kindness, but I did read Marion Tave's book, All My Puny Sorrows.
Oh, yeah.
Which very much deals with like mental health. And the vibe I got was it was like a pray it away type of thing.
There very much is. There very much is that, but I don't think not to the level of what's the one, the Christian Scientist, I think, where they don't allow blood. They don't allow blood transfusions, or they don't allow medicine, and there's nothing like that. But there certainly is a, God never gives you more than you can handle, and thoughts and prayers are actual solutions to things, and there definitely is part of that. Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that must have been really difficult for your grandmother then, growing up in her childhood, I guess. So you say she never wanted to be a mother. I wonder what her dreams would have been, what she would have wanted.
Yeah. Well, I don't think anybody ever asked her. But I do have that. My mother passed away a number of years ago in 2012. So I do know that my mom is the one who told me that when she was talking about her mother, she's like, she's like, I know that my mom didn't want to have children, and I'm fairly certain my mom didn't love her children. Is what my mother said. But
I was going to ask for how did your grandmother's mental illness represent itself? How did it manifest? Did she have overt symptoms? Do we know anything about how much of that affected her behavior, or was it under control with medication?
It's very hard to say. For me, when you're experiencing things as a child, you see them through a child's eyes. So I can't really say that I would know. I know one anecdote that my father has told me many times was that when my granddad died in the mid-1990s, there was kind of a realization of how much he was doing to kind of hold her in check. Mm-hmm. My dad told me that my mom at times when leaving her parents' house, my mom would sometimes be angry at her father for the way he spoke to my grandmother. She kind of thought he was shutting her down, and she kind of thought it was part of this chauvinistic, women need to be told to shut their mouth kind of situation. And when he passed away, I think the family kind of realized pretty quickly how much he was just like, he was shutting her down, but it was a lot to prevent the crazy from coming out, for lack of a better. I know that's a very insensitive term, and I'm sorry I used it, but that's kind of how we spoke about it in the family. When my granddad passed away in the mid '90s, her mental health did take a dramatic turn, and at one point, her children, my mom and her two brothers, had her committed to a mental hospital, and that was the experience where she looked at my uncle, who was clearly her favorite, and that everybody knew that, and said that he should have been drowned at birth.
Ooh. Yeah, ouch. That's dark.
So what was your relationship like with her?
As a child, it was okay, I guess. Basically, like, we would go, like, I have memories of going to their house and then just going into the basement to play. You know, and then we'd come upstairs for dinner, and then we would leave. Like, I mean, she was my grandmother. She was in the house. We didn't have a lot of one-on-one time ever. And then as I got older, I definitely didn't communicate with her very much at all. Maybe you would go like once a year for Christmas or whatever. Mm-hmm. And even then we wouldn't talk all that much. And I mean, she said a very funny thing one time. I mean, I'm sure it's probably clear to you by now with all of the talk I've done about religion. I've walked away from all of it. I believe in nothing, and I've just moved on with that part of my life. Mm-hmm. And I am married to a lovely woman. And when we were dating, or maybe we had just got engaged, I was at Christmas, and my grandmother asked me, your fiance is a Catholic. It's like, yep, she was raised in a Catholic family. And she asked, is that going to be a problem for you? And I was like, I just laughed. I just laughed it off. But that just kind of speaks to the disconnect. Like, yeah. You know, and like, it kind of, all of my encounters with her was essentially just pretending to be something and someone I'm not, and just kind of going along.
Yeah. And it's kind of interesting, and like also very sad that the religion, it sounds like it forced her into a life that she didn't want and that she wasn't prepared to take on. And as a result, you know, perhaps that's why she was deeply unhappy or whatnot. But like, there's also this kind of lack of insight and expectation that her family still participates in that, you know? So that's kind of strange. What's a story that captures her essence, like who she was?
So I was talking to my wife a few years ago, and it was kind of when I decided, you know what, I'm out. I'm just done. I'm tapping out of that part of my life. And I was talking to my wife, and I said, you know, it's funny. I mean, everything is always about her. Every conversation, like everything is about her. And I said, and she's literally been doing it all my life. And my wife, being a communications person, always gives me a raised eyebrow when I say dumb things like literally, because we all say literally when we don't mean it. And then I thought about it for a split second. I was like, no, wait, actually, yes, literally, because the day I was born, I was born 1 month premature, which is not extremely dramatic. I was fine. There also happened to be a snowstorm, but it was December in Manitoba, so that's also not shocking. And my parents drove 7 miles to the closest town with a hospital in it, and that's where I was born. My grandmother had been petitioning my parents to, instead of driving 7 miles to the closest hospital, they should instead drive 25 miles to the better hospital. On the day I was born, she was raising such a stink about this and calling my father to yell at him and scream at him about what a terrible thing was happening and that her grandchild is going to die because he's being born a month premature and those incompetent boobs at that hospital are going to screw everything up. And I think that kind of captures all of it, in that there's so much pessimism, there's so much negativity, and there's so much everyone else is doing something wrong.
Yeah.
And that kind of sums, I mean, and then the story continues on from again, I hear the story more from my father than anybody else. The story then goes on to say that my father at one point was so exasperated, he hung up the phone on my granny to the point, and that made her so angry that my granddad had to come over to the house to have a talk with my dad about, I don't know what, but making it right or whatever. And then, like, that's kind of the story of the time I was born.
Yeah.
You know,
not
that's
the happiest story that it should be.
Exactly. Like, I mean,
you know?
I mean, I'm not some great gift to the world.
Yes, you are.
But
Josh.
that, and I certainly,
but it's all wrapped up in this drama with your granny.
I mean, I certainly didn't need to be celebrated and championed. You know, and all of those things. But it would be nice to have a story of my birth that didn't have this huge, ugly, negative story attached to it. If it was if there was my parents were just puppies when they got married. I think my mom was 21 when I was born. My dad was 22. Like, this could have been a cute, fun story of these two young kids having to drive in the 7 miles of some type of snowstorm in Manitoba in the middle of the night. You know, and here I am a month premature, which screws up all of their plans. And, you know, that could have been a funny, cute story, but that's not the one I have. I have this negative, ugly story about people yelling at each other and hanging up the phone and having to apologize awkwardly later.
Yeah. Drama.
So not a great relationship between you and your granny from the get-go.
From day one. Yeah, you know? I was a mistake.
It's like you wrecked my birthday, my actual birthday. Yeah. What do you think your mom's childhood was like?
Well, okay. So my mom was the oldest of 3 children. And again, very patriarchal, very anti-woman. I mean, farming families in general, right? Like, the firstborn son is a very important thing in traditional conservative farming tradition families. That's always a big factor. I think it might be a bit more in the Mennonite religious culture. I don't know that for sure. I know it's a thing in all of them anyway. And my mother had the unfortunate audacity to be born a woman, and she was the firstborn. And she was a woman. And my mom did tell me on more than one occasion that she knows her mother resented her for it forever. And that's something that my mom carried. And then, of course, the secondborn was a boy. And, of course, he was the absolute favorite. And then there was a third son who was also not as favorite as the firstborn son. And I know that my mom was... There was a moment where I spoke earlier about Granny's diagnosis in the 1970s with something. I know that there was a moment where she had to go to the city to go to the hospital. I don't know what exactly that meant, other than she was having some type of mental breakdown and she needed to go for some type of medical care. But of course, nobody talks specifically about it. So all I know is she went to a hospital in the city. My mom remembers that. and her two brothers do not. So my mom was kind of aware. I think because of that, she probably had a bit of a mothering role, as you see some children happens to some children.
Yeah, for sure.
In families of mental health issues or alcoholism or any of those, you hear those stories all the time. Of usually the oldest daughter is the one who takes up some of the load.
Yeah.
Pattern of the patriarchy just continues to repeat itself.
Fuck the patriarchy, right? That's the theme of this episode.
Yeah.
Yeah, and my mom did tell me, she said she had no way of knowing for sure, but she suspected because I was the firstborn of my parents, and my mom was the eldest of her siblings. I was my grandmother's first grandchild. But my mom suspected that she kind of resented that I was born a male. No, that's not true. She actually said something about it. She actually said to my mother, "It's too bad it's not a girl because I was really hoping that the boys would have my grandsons." Or something to that effect. Like
Weird.
Yeah.
There's always just a little jab, hey?
Yep.
Yeah.
A little jab in all of those actions.
Yeah. And my mom would tell stories about, being 15 years old and going out on a date, and some boy coming to pick her up in a pickup truck probably, and my granny saying as she's walking out the door, "Don't come home pregnant." And it's like where is this even coming from? Like that's like it's automatically, it's not just automatically pessimistic. It's pessimistic the worst.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, just like full of judgment about what her behavior might be and not giving her any
credit.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Credit. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So when you were talking about like hanging out at your grandmother's house, like in the basement, kids are sort of seen, not heard kind of thing, or like limited.
Yeah, which is
like she didn't want to like spend, like she sounds like she wasn't really enjoying the company of children in general. She wasn't obviously not baking you cookies and like trying to spoil you, but like it sounds like, it was just.
Right, which is the opposite from my granddad, who loved children. He, like, when the grandkids would come over, he absolutely adored them and would want to spend as much time with them as possible. I have so many memories of going over to my grandparents' house and granddad, like, taking me in the pickup and going to do farm stuff and just being this little 6-year-old kid in this pickup truck without a seatbelt on, I'm sure. Hanging around all of this heavy equipment and machinery, but there I was just doing it.
And this is her husband?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So not all negative at that household, right? Like,
No.
So like that's really interesting. Mm-hmm. So you get to go there, and your granddad would be like all stoked and taking you guys out and doing things, but your granny's just kind of bitter.
Yeah, I mean,
over it.
And while I have positive memories of my granddad. I mean, that was generally short-lived because by the time I was 10, he had some pretty serious health issues. Mm-hmm. So and he died when I was 16. So like my last 6 years of memory of him are not him being negative from being a bad guy perspective, but he was in a lot of pain. So you would go over there and he was just uncomfortable.
Right.
So that was sad.
Yeah.
Can I go back to something you had said earlier, just to like fill in the blanks, I guess, for myself. When you were saying that you associate like that whole family, like your grandmother and like that side of the family with how you grew up, is that because they're more religious and like they're more of like the judgmental, like the stuff that you faced like in your church?
No, it's not one-to-one like that.
Okay.
That side of the family was very negative. My mom's side of the family. There wasn't a lot of love in the house. There wasn't a lot of love between my mom and her siblings. one of, I'm going to say the oldest of the uncles, oldest of my two uncles. I would say probably, I don't know this for sure, but I would say probably also has some type of bipolar disorder. I know there were many a family gathering ruined by a aggressive temper tantrum with things being thrown and walls being punched and doors being slammed. That was kind of it was never a comfortable, positive environment. And I know that there was a lot there, patriarchy weighing in on my mother. And there was a lot of negativity on my mother from all of that. And we talked about a lot of it, my mom and I, as I was in my 20s and into my 30s until she passed away. On my dad's side of the family, complete opposite. It's like is it Norman Rockwell painting? Is that the thing people say? Like, it's a picture, like that family is just a picture of love and just everybody's happy to see each other and supportive of one another and disagree on everything from politics to religious situation, whatever. Like, just so many disagreements, but it's always friendly. There's so much there. I was just talking to my dad the other day and making fun of him because he actually has a bit of a health issue going on in his life right now, and he is complaining because his sister is calling him too much. And I'm like, Dad, this is not the first time this has happened where your major complaint about your family is that my aunt loves you too much. Yeah. And that's the kind of stuff that comes from that side of the family. So I guess I have this negative thing that was always this ball of negativity in my life. And then there's my upbringing in that community, which I know logically are disconnected things. They are separate. Mm-hmm. But I guess when you grow up and you move away and you try to move on, you process these things and you kind of package your trauma the way you need to package your trauma. Mm-hmm. And I think I've kind of put it all into there. And when it comes to that family, my uncle I have not spoken to since the day before my mom passed away, and I will never speak to him again. And my other uncle has passed away, and my mom has passed away, and my granddad has died. So literally the only person there is my grandmother, who I'm choosing to not speak to. Right. Which I guess is also kind of ironic, because here I am talking about how much excommunication is a problem, and I'm the one also doing it in return. But there's probably something a therapist could explore on that one too.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Well, you've got to do what you got to do in terms of boundaries to keep yourself healthy, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. What I was going to say was my husband, Steve, his grandfather, we have to cut all this out stuff, by the way. His grandfather was like what him and his dad describe as, old, super grumpy Italian, very much like the controller of the house. Steve's mom would never say a bad word about her father, but she said, what you need to understand about my father is that he never had love growing up. And so in Italy, when you had too many kids, you'd often just give one away to a farm or something, and they would go work a farm with somebody else. And that's what happened to her dad. So he grew up without any family or any love. And
I'm sorry, they would give extra kids to a farm to go work on a farm?
Yeah, if you couldn't support them, you couldn't feed them, just try to find them. It sounded like giving away a dog you can't take care of.
Wow, yeah, it really
he was given away to someone, and was at 8 years old, and was essentially raised as a farm boy, and not even allowed to sleep in the house or something. That's what I remember. But what Benita would say is that there was a culture in her house growing up of you only kiss your kids after they're asleep.
Okay.
Yeah. You don't show love and affection to your kids, because it's a sign that you might be spoiling them, or I'm maybe that's an extrapolation, but I'm relating that a little bit to this culture of priding yourself on being humble, and maybe there's something to that. You don't show your kids love. it could spoil them. And that's the attitude that, my mother-in-law's dad had. And he didn't have, and he also had no demonstration of love himself, and why that's important in a family and why kids need that. But then when you're talking about things like, just like the buttons and the excommunicating and, the kind of judgment and the pridefulness, I wonder if there's something to that.
I know I've spoken to my dad about this before, about his dad, and what you said there about not showing love to your children, there might actually have been, like, it clearly wouldn't be the case anymore, but there might be some self-protection there too. I know when my grandpa was born, he was born in Russia, and he came to Canada when he was, I think, 7. I think his parents had something like 12 children, but only 5 of them lived past the age of 4.
Oh, so sad.
Right? And I mean, that was Russia in the late 1800s, right? That was their reality.
Yeah.
So maybe, you
right. I see what you're saying.
You have to wait. You can't let yourself get too connected, right? You kind of have to treat them like livestock until they get to a certain point that now we can form an emotional bond, because if I get attached to all 12 of these children, I got to bury more than half of them. That's going to tear me apart emotionally.
Totally. That's a good point. There might be, some total self-preservation there in not allowing yourself to give too much. And like, then maybe there's something too, like another complicating factor is the religion, that if you're showing all this love and affection for your children, like, what do you have left for God? I don't know. I'm not a religious person.
That's always a factor, I think.
Yeah.
God can never have enough.
God gets jealous. So I don't know. Yeah, but it sounds just like it wouldn't have been the happiest environment.
No, but I was wondering though, like, do you think your grandmother was unusual or typical in like how she was raising her kids, like in that environment, in that religion?
I think many of the things of the prioritization of the male gender, I think a lot of the conservatism, I think a lot of those things were very typical, and very, very common among women of her generation, in her contemporaries, I guess. But I think the mental health part of it is what made it toxic. I mean, it's all kind of toxic to begin with, but it kind of amps it up.
For
when
sure.
When it now, not only is it this weird structured thing established by generations of tradition, it now has this randomness wild card attached to it. That I think was what made it more difficult.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense for sure.
Or as Robin, as you mentioned earlier, you have to do what you have to do for your own mental health, right? So I've shut that off for my reasons, and they're mine. And it's about my mental health and me dealing with the things I need to deal with. But at the same time, when I'm being generous, and I think about my grandmother, who at times is cruel, at times is hurtful, sometimes and often intentionally cruel and hurtful. But when I'm being generous and think about it from the other side, her life story is a very sad story. She, mental health probably didn't get the help she needed. She had 3 children. 2 of them passed away before they were 60. She had 2 husbands. She buried both of them. Her life is full of a lot of sadness.
Yeah, a lot of loss.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for being our first shitty grandparent story. It's all been kind of heartwarming, or we look up to them so much, or all these. So we were on the hunt for evil grandparents. Not saying she's evil. It's obviously not it, but just more dynamic stories, because they're not all heartwarming, but ultimately have an impact on our families and who we are. And I think that's, like I always say, what's interesting about the podcast and about looking at your grandparents' stories is you learn about history, you learn about your family, and ultimately you learn about yourself, because we're all a product of them in some way, good or bad.
Absolutely.
So yeah. Thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it.
No problem.
Thank you for listening to Stories from Grandparents. If you have any interest in submitting stories, or if you want to participate on the podcast, please send us an email at storiesfromgrandparentspodcast@gmail.com.
And don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. It really helps us out.